Welcome back. This is presentation 2 of chapter 15, foreign policy. We've been talking about sort of the main goals of foreign policy. Now we're going to start talking a little bit about the institutions and organizations that the presidents use in order to basically formulate and conduct foreign policy. These are mainly institutions found within the executive branch. So American foreign policy is shaped by government and non-governmental actors. Again, foreign policy formulation and conduct is the product of a variety of interests, movements, governmental institutions. And while the president and his chief foreign policy advisors are the principal architects of U.S. foreign policy, there are other countervailing forces, Congress, interest groups, trade associations, that also play very important roles. So the president and the executive branch, the president is the leading figure in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy, and they have expanded their authorities well beyond the original authorizations within the Constitution. While the Constitution's framers envisioned the presidency as the chief instrument of foreign policy, they also included checks on executive authority to illustrate the House at least potentially controls the purse strings, as we found with the debate over aid to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. They can choose not to fund presidential foreign policy initiatives. The Senate can use its advice and consent authority to reject presidential appointments, and the federal courts can rule on challenges to the constitutionality of the president's actions in foreign policy. Think about what the courts, how Trump's ban on foreign travel affected the way things, whether people could come in or out of the United States. While only 5 of the 15 presidents in the most recent past had foreign policy experience, all recent presidents have been confronted with significant foreign policy challenges. When you think back, Presidents Hoover, Eisenhower, Nixon, and George H.W. Bush and Joe Biden had pretty extensive foreign policy experience. George H.W. Bush, having served as U.S. ambassador to the UN, UN liaison to the People's Republic of China, director of Central Intelligence, as well as vice president. He was considered to have been the most uniquely qualified presidents in terms of foreign policy experience. George W. Bush responded to the attacks of 9/11, and the war on terrorism with what became known as the Bush Doctrine, which was basically saying we're not going to wait around for people to attack us. We will engage in preemption if we believe we have credible evidence that a foreign actor is seeking to attack us. And again, that most often meant, terrorist organizations on other countries' soil. Obama delivered a very important foreign policy speech on May 28, 2014. He argued for, he's basically reacting against, Trump's much more aggressive, prosecution of the war on terror. He argued for reduced reliance on military force to advance U.S. national security, arguing instead that we needed, to rely more on diplomacy as the main instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Nevertheless, during Obama's 2 terms, the use of armed drone attacks against suspected terrorists throughout the Middle East escalated, and in fact went beyond nations that had originally been authorized for the use of military force with the original authorization that came after the 9/11 attacks. George W. Bush famously said that he was the decider, and as the dominant figure in American foreign policy and military policy, presidents are uniquely positioned to decide with whom, when, and how American military forces will intervene in the world. President Obama's decision to launch a joint special forces strike against al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in 2012 in an allied country, Pakistan, illustrates the capacity that presidents have to take unilateral action. A lot of people think that him acting so decisively in killing Osama bin Laden, especially on Pakistani soil, was the kind of bold stroke that actually contributed to his election victory in 2012. Presidents can also make extensive use of executive agreements to bypass Congress in foreign relations. Since 1947, the United States has entered into 17,000 different executive agreements with other nations and international entities. Now, the upside is you don't need Congress. The downside is future presidents can always simply reverse it with a stroke of a pen. Donald Trump campaigned for president as an American first guy. His foreign policy of basically saying we're going to care, we question NATO, and in fact, basically said they're not paying their dues, and he, questioned the utility of NATO, and that deeply concerned traditional U.S. allies who had already been concerned in the 2000s by the way the Bush administration had behaved, and in Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, dismissively describing European powers like Germany and France as old Europe. Trump initially had a very confrontational stance towards North Korea and Iran, but ultimately appeared to be reluctant to follow up with military force, although again, late in his first term, he did authorize the assassination of a major Iranian military figure, the guy that was the leader of what is known as the Quds Force, which is sort of like the Iranian special forces. Trump appeared to favor symmetry with face-to-face meetings with rivals like North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Russia's Vladimir Putin. He liked to place himself in the center of the foreign policy process. He often did so in ways that were not particularly effective because, again, the point of symmetry is that you achieve things, and oftentimes Trump just wanted to be in the center of the situation rather than actually being part of what was, what could be a major diplomatic effort. America side by side, again, when you look at the volume of foreign aid in billions of dollars, in terms of crude amount of money, the United States is well beyond anybody else. But again, in terms of the percentage of gross national income, we don't give that much in comparison to other countries. Germany contributes, 0.6% of its GNI. The United States, contributes about 1.5%. And again, that reflects something important, which is, again, we are, the most wealthy, affluent country in the world by a lot. The National Security Council was created in 1947 with passage of the National Security Act as an advisory body within the executive office of the president, the EOP. The National Security Council was designed to enable the president to better coordinate and synthesize information and to enable the president to formulate foreign policy. To some extent, it was designed to basically, kind of yield to the recognition that some presidents weren't going to be foreign policy experts, and they needed to have at their fingertips, the range of appropriate responses. So one byproduct of this is that it facilitated the creation of what foreign policy people call a White House-centered foreign policy, where presidents didn't need to work nearly as much through the State Department to achieve their foreign policy ends. The heart of the NSC is its staff of around 200 foreign policy experts drawn from throughout the military and executive branch. Most NSC staffers are foreign policy experts who are capable of providing the president with detailed analysis of military, economic, and political issues. Obama had a very large National Security Council. Trump, when he came in, pared that back quite a bit. So again, the size of the National Security Council will vary from administration to administration. The head of the National Security Council is the National Security Advisor, who is appointed by the president but not subject to Senate confirmation. And the NSA is a guy that works very closely with the president, and again is there on a day-to-day basis to provide him with close advice. And again, the problem with the lack of Senate confirmation is that an irresponsible president could appoint somebody who is dangerous as national security advisor. And Trump did that. His first national security advisor was a guy named Michael Flynn, who was a former general who had been sort of summarily removed from his position as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is one of the major one of the major intelligence agencies within the intelligence community, because he was viewed as unreliable. So again, that's sort of the problem that you have. And he again had, I believe, the shortest tenure of any NSA. He had to resign like 22 days into Trump's administration. The State Department, again, is the first federal agency created in 1789 to handle routine matters of international diplomacy. The department is headed by the Secretary of State, who historically was the most important foreign policy official after the president, and in many instances eclipsed the president in terms of foreign policy influence when you had presidents that really weren't that interested in foreign policy. The Secretary's actual importance varies with his or her relationship to the president. For example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was barely aware that Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, existed. In contrast, President George W. Bush worked very closely with Condoleezza Rice, who was his second Secretary of State and had previously served as his national security advisor. So the State Department oversees more than 300 U.S. embassies, consulates, and diplomatic missions around the world, and employs around 30,000 Foreign Service officers and other personnel, and operates on an annual budget of around $52.5 billion. That's a lot of money until you compare, a lot of people and a lot of money until you compare it to the State Department or to the Defense Department. The power of recognition, the diplomatic power of recognition, means again that the United States accepts a nation's government as lawful and will engage in routine trade and diplomatic exchanges and accept its citizens' passport for travel into the United States. The State Department plays an important behind-the-scenes role in the use of diplomacy to promote the general welfare of Americans abroad. As President Donald Trump did not follow long-established State Department procedures for diplomacy, again, he preferred to, start with summitry with foreign leaders and leave it to staff to fill in details later. In an unprecedented move, Trump had a 2018 meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin by himself, without any White House or State Department staffers present, and basically would routinely order people within the room to tear up their notes when he met with some foreign leaders. Trump's lack of discipline caused numerous problems over his 4-year term. Chief among those problems was a 2019 phone call with Ukraine's newly elected President Volodymyr Zelensky, where Trump departed from his script to discuss allegations of former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. That call resulted in Trump's first impeachment by House Democrats. And again, that was a situation where you had a whistleblower, if you remember from our earlier discussion, who basically said what was being done was illegal. The Department of Defense, originally created as the War Department in 1789. Originally, there were two departments, the War Department and the Department of the Navy, that dealt with military-related issues. The National Security Act of 1947 reorganized the military establishment into one cabinet-level department. Each of the military services is led by a chief of staff, who collectively comprise the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Each of the main military services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, are led by a civilian secretary and have military bureaucracies to serve them. White House-centered foreign policy has often prioritized military force and prioritized the military generally for sources of information, advice, and policy implementation. The reforms in 1980 created what were known as combatant commands throughout the world, who report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The intelligence agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency is the kind of the core civilian all-source intelligence agency. All-source means they can get information from anywhere within the intelligence community. It's interesting that the Defense Department controls 80% of the intelligence community's budget. In 2005, Congress created the position of Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, to better coordinate intelligence activities and prepare the President's daily brief. The Director of Central Intelligence was often viewed with mistrust within the intelligence community because that person was both the head of an important intelligence agency in its own right, but also was the statutory leader of the entire community. This is known as dual hatting and often created a lot of trust issues. Institutional infighting has generally caused the office of the Director of National Intelligence to be somewhat ineffective. Finally, the last thing we're going to talk about in this presentation is the National Security Agency, or NSA. This is a highly influential and very secretive and very controversial intelligence agency. It's housed within the Department of Defense, but the NSA director reports directly to the President. The NSA is the primary collections agency for what is known as SIGINT, which is Signals Intelligence, and has important intelligence and counterintelligence missions. Again, they're the ones that tap phones and intercept any kind of electronic signals. Following media revelations of intelligence abuses in the 1970s, Congress enacted the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 to place limits on electronic surveillance and to compel the intelligence agencies to obtain warrants in many covered instances. In 2019, the FISA court charged that the FBI made a practice of providing false information to the court and demanded, again, immediate changes in FBI procedures. So that's it for this slide. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of foreign policy. I'll see you next time.